Thank you both. Just real quick, there are cards, and I think some of you may have filled out questions, and as time permits, we hope to get to some of those questions after we get a couple from the chamber. So if you have cards, make sure they get over to Peter and the chamber staff so that we can funnel them up to me and maybe get a couple of those questions in tonight. As we go through the questions, if we could hold applause until the end of the presentations and the closings. We are at a little bit of a tight time in the school, and we don't want to keep the staff here later than we have to. So with that, we did draw out back. The first question will be directed to Mr. Jordan. And the question comes from the chamber. The majority of our over 1,000 members are small businesses with less than 10 employees, and many are family-owned businesses that are the economic backbone of their local communities. A minimum wage increase proposal has significant importance to these businesses. On this issue, what are your views, and what is the one issue you will champion in the New York Assembly, if elected, to help these local businesses succeed, grow, and thrive?
I don't think anyone will question that we need to find a way to make the lives of our working families better. And one way to accomplish that, certainly, is to improve the ability of their earning potential. I think where my opponent and I will differ is how do you accomplish that? A few things on minimum wage that I think are important to understand. 54% of the people who are on minimum wage currently are under the age of 23. Within 6 months, the vast majority of people who start out in a career at minimum wage or a job at minimum wage will be off of minimum wage within 6 months. We cannot ask our businesses at a time when the economy is as difficult and as challenging as it is today to bear the burden of raising minimum wage in New York alone. We need to find a way to help our families succeed. One way to consider doing that, and one way that we have proposed, and I proposed during the debate on the floor on this bill, was, on the minimum wage bill that was proposed, was let's look at the earned income tax credit. That is a program designed specifically for working families. It provides them with a supplemental income. We could look to enhance that. That would provide the return for our families that they need, but at the same time protecting the very businesses that we're trying to encourage to grow and develop in New York. Listen, New York trails in every indicator across the country. We are, if not 50th, we're 49th as the least business-friendly state. Our businesses in this state compete against businesses from throughout the country and the world. We need to change the culture of New York to make it more business-friendly. And you ask, what will we advocate for the strongest over the next 2 years? Regulatory reform. That in of itself will produce a greater return on investment for our businesses, allow them to grow and share the success with their employees.
Thank you. Let me give you some simple math. In an hour of labor, it costs a business $17. $7.50 of that goes to the employee, and $9.50 of it goes to the government. If we want to put more money in the pockets of employees, which we should, because it'll have a stimulative effect, then we need to take some money away from the government. One area to focus on is unemployment insurance. Unemployment went up this year, and so why don't we just reduce unemployment? Since we don't really want to pay people to work to not work, we want to pay people to work. We can do that. If we do that, we can put more money in the hands of employees without impacting the bottom line of the small businesses.
Mr.
In terms of the second part of the question, dealing with what will be the one thing we advocate, regulatory reform begins to sound very cliche, and I think that the way we emphasize that is a good friend of mine's mom's own a restaurant, and when the Department of Health comes in, they panic. They're concerned with what's going to be found, what's going to be discovered, that may be an insignificant issue, but will result in a fine of $1,000, $2,000, $3,000. The reality is that's the mindset in our state agencies we need to change. They need to change from being viewed as the enemy, viewing business as the enemy, and look at ourselves as partners to try to make New York a better state, a more profitable state, and a state where people want to come back and work and live and start businesses and grow businesses.
Thank you. The next question. The agricultural sector is a critical component of the economy and quality of life throughout our district. Please share with us your specific ideas or initiatives that you will support, and if will pass, improve the long-term sustainability of the region's agricultural sector.
Thank you. So our farms this year particularly are hurting. The margin pressure is incredible because of the drought that in the Midwest and even here at home. So clearly one of the things that we have to be concerned about is ensuring that farms remain a viable business. You know, New York State produces enough food to feed 40% of our population, and we lose 3% of our farmland every year. It doesn't take a rocket scientist or even a farmer to realize that that is a losing strategy. We need to focus on things that will help farms: access to capital, access to a viable labor force, protection for farmland so that it can remain farms. Specific things that I would support would be an agricultural venture fund to provide farmers with a better source of funding. New York State has a venture fund for high-tech businesses. The controller ought to have a similar fund for farms. We should be fully funding the EPF grant, so the EPF fund, so that we can support additional grants for agriculture and farmland conservation. And then we also need to think about access to markets. These days, farmers go to market electronically, but we don't have a technology infrastructure in our rural communities to support that. So we need to invest in rural broadband so that farmers can better get their products to market.
Mr. Jordan, on the question of agriculture.
Yeah, I think part of the problem, it's a mixed federal issue and a mixed state issue. I mean, nationally, we have a cheap food policy. We want our groceries to be inexpensive. We spend far less on foods than any other developed country in the world. The problem is we place the burden of that on the backs of our farmers. That's a federal issue on how we address the pricing and the structure and similarly. But locally, what can we do? Farmers want to stay in farming because they love it. Farmers will stay in farming if they can make a profit at it. My son last night at Boy Scouts gave a presentation on, for one of his merit badges, had to give a presentation. He talked about a farm where he worked this summer and what they do to protect the environment. Half of what he discussed is required and does nothing to protect the environment. The other half is required and does a great deal to protect the environment. The problem is the costs associated with the half equal about $50,000 a year for this farmer. That's 1.5, 2 employees a year. We need to address the regulations that will help our small businesses that include ag and all of the industries that make New York State home.
You're absolutely right. The regulations in this state are overwhelming. I talk to farmers, I talk to business leaders, and I've got a whole binder here full of unfunded mandates that they provided me with. We have to do something to make the regulatory environment simpler and more business friendly. If we don't, then we will continue to lose farms and lose businesses out into the future.
Thank you. You just provided a good segue to the first question from the floor. And the topic is, along the term of the buzzwords of regulatory reform, mandate relief. It's been a lot in the news the last couple of years. It's been a hot topic in the state. And the question that comes from the floor is, I've heard that mandate relief will be the most important issue being addressed in the New York State Legislature in 2013. What specific reforms will you champion in your conference, if elected, and compromises would you make to ensure mandate relief is passed? Mr. Jordan, will start with you.
The one thing that you hear most often is, and I think there are 2 issues that need to be addressed. In our local governments, the vast majority of their budgets, Saratoga Springs, for instance, 80% of their budget is made up in labor costs. Now, you can't eliminate labor costs, but we have to look at what are the drivers and the forces that drive those costs up continually that cannot be controlled by the locals that have to be. We have to find a way to address those. I think we need to have an open and honest discussion about pension reform. The question is not any longer, what is someone worth or what does someone deserve? We also have to add to that discussion what is sustainable. Can we continue as a state to ask our localities to fund increasing demands into the pension system at a time when they're also strapped with a tax cap? And we're all seeing in the papers where, although the stock market is performing very well, the requirements for contributions from localities into the various pensions is going up. The reason is quite simple. Outflows are exceeding inflows. Therefore, the localities have to make up the difference. We need to find a way to address that. For our schools, sitting here in this beautiful auditorium, we can't leave out schools. The biggest challenge for our schools, any educator in this room will know, when they, if you have kids, I have 4 children, they all learn differently. Throughout their education, teachers are taught individualized instruction, but when they arrive in New York to teach, they're cordoned into a little box, and it's going to be standardized. I think the state ed department needs to make a shift in the paradigm and say to schools, you have an objective. Here are your objectives. Here are your measurables. If you meet those, great, we support you. If you don't, we will step in to help you. And I think that is, in terms of a specific mandate, allow our schools to meet the goals in the ways they deem most fit. Don't regulate Newcomb the same way we do Shenandoah or Public School 29.
Ms. Woerner, a question of mandate.
I think my opponent is correct in that the one-size-fits-all policymaking that has guided, the one-size-fits-all policymaking that has guided the state education department is really doing a disservice to our students. I collect lists of unfunded mandates everywhere I go, as I said, and it's really kind of, excuse the expression, a dog's breakfast. There are thousands of them, and if we're going to try and make a difference, we've got to pick them off. And so I've got my top 5 unfunded mandates here, and I'll just give you the three of them. One, fully funding municipal 911 call centers. Each of you on your telephone bills is paying a surcharge for 911 calls. Well, the state has collected $600 million in fees from you over the last 15 years, and only 14% of it has actually gone back to municipalities to fund 911 calls. The municipalities are having to pick up the rest of the tab. That's got to get fixed. The state education department requires that all students take Regents exams. It also charges the schools for those tests and for scoring those tests. If we could get the state education department to give back some of the money that it held back from the Race to the Top funding, they might actually be able to pay for those tests.